It wasn't that our parents let us out. They really thought they knew where we were going. The unfortunate part for them is that we're military kids, so we're survivors, and we figure out a way around everything. And we had an unwritten rule between the siblings, which was if they didn't ask, we didn't tell.
So good morning, everyone. Welcome to a podcast with interesting people. Today we have a book author. Sandy, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Okay. I'm a brat, and I don't mean a small letter B-R-A-T. I mean like a big letter, E-R-A-T, which means British Regiment Attached Transfer. We're a small group. Actually, we're not small. There's about 15 million of us adult brats in America, but we're not really recognized. Someone says, are you a veteran? I go, I think I am. I traveled everywhere with my military family and went around the world, even to Vietnam, which is where this memoir has originated from. I'm an author. I'm a designer. I worked on the design of a theme park, consultant for marketing. I'm a painter. So I'm a little bit of a jack of all trades, but I think that a lot of brats are that way.
Looking through your book and some of the topics that you covered in there, tell us a little bit more about the book. Tell us about your experience there and how it shaped your life.
Well, I think it all came together when my father, who used to go into the basement and come up with stuff, he was General Patton's ordnance officer in World War II, and he worked on the design of the Sherman tank, and he was kind of that guy, and they were going to send him to Vietnam. But prior to that, I happened to come across his stash of photos from World War II of a concentration camp. He was an amateur photographer, but he kept all these things hidden. And when he was about 86, he slid over this, I'd say, government folder with all of this beautifully scripted, written in English on onion skin paper. And he said, it's time. And I said, well, what's it time for, Colonel? Always called him Colonel. He said, it's time for you to write something compelling. I asked if he'd rather have a documentary. He said, no. He said, Americans don't like to talk about Vietnam. So I think you need to bring them in a way in which they can identify with it and then go about giving them the information that would help them understand the what and the why of Vietnam. So I say I'm a brat, I'm a spy. I grew up in Vietnam at the age of 10 in the early 60s. And I wanted to tell this story because when I asked him why, because at that point he was in his 80s, he said, if you don't understand history, you're destined to repeat it. And it's critical that this understanding begins to develop with people because we're doing the same thing in the Middle East.
So in the title of your book, The Ignorance of Bliss, tell me a little bit more about the ignorance. How does that factor into the title of the book?
Well, ignorance is defined as lack of information or knowledge. And bliss is happiness without actually being oblivious to those things around you. And so for me, I felt like we came into this country ignorant. We had the McCarthy era, which made it so that nobody was in government that had any understanding of this country, its culture, its history, the fact that they'd been fighting the Chinese for 2,000 years. And in looking at it, I felt as though, I needed to bring you in without you feeling as though there would be guilt or there would be accusations or there'd be anything. And I thought the voice of the child would do that. But in the process, I make sure there's moments in history in which I help you understand what happened then or what happened later. So you really have a good read, but at the same time, you're going to be learning a lot.
Some of the things that you mentioned in the book, you were 10, right, when you were there?
Yes, 10 to 12.
10 to 12. So, a young girl in a foreign country. How was that experience? How did that shape you? What kind of experiences did you experience over there? Did you take with you that later on in life you were like, wow, I understand, like this really impacted me. Like I feel like I'm doing what I'm doing right now because of some of those experiences. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, when we first got there, we really were like the French. We moved in and we were in their villas. We had servants. We had, this decadent life. And, it was wonderful. My mother certainly enjoyed it. And about a month or so into being in Saigon, my brothers and my sister and I mistakenly went to what we thought was a parade. I was so excited. And my brother's basketball was under his arm. And, we were thrilled to be there. But it turned out to be a coup. And about 400 people got shot around us. I think this was a defining moment for me. Because I really felt like I had to make up for the fact that these people didn't have their lives. So as a child, not only did I become very attentive to everything around me, because I had my younger brother and sister as my charge. I had to kind of keep an eye on them and take care of them. But I also felt at that point that was the moment my childhood went away. Because then there were all sorts of other things. There were coups, there were bombings, there were kidnappings. And so you became leery. But what a child does is, the child lives in the continuous present. And then that's what children do. It's you stay in the moment. And it isn't probably till later that things start to come out or you start to realize. I was in a class at Cal Arts and there was an earthquake. California. And it was that moment that with the shaking of the earth, I went right back to the bombing and, really had to leave the room. And that was probably the first time I recognized that there were implications to what we had experienced.
As a 10, 12-year-old girl in Vietnam, you and your brother were selling in the market items and just... the way you describe is that military kids are so resilient and so independent. The experience that you had in Vietnam probably shaped you towards that end as well. Nowadays you can't even imagine letting a kid out somewhere, go to the market and then, or just like do whatever you want to do. How is that? How do you see things different now than they were before?
I definitely think kids are on a short leash. It wasn't that our parents let us out. They really thought they knew where we were going. The unfortunate part for them is that we're military kids, so we're survivors, and we figure out a way around everything. And we had an unwritten rule between siblings, which was if they didn't ask, we didn't tell. So my brother, I happened to see him running back to the bus after we had been dropped off for many, many times at the Underground Theater. That was a place my mother could count on. She could send us. There'd be a movie. I don't think she realized there was a USO show beforehand, with little skimpy women dressed in skimpy clothing. And, it was great for the soldiers, but for the officers. But we would go in and they would show the same movie forever if the general was on reconnaissance. So it happened that he was on reconnaissance for a long time, and they had shown the movie The World of Susie Wong 21 times. I couldn't take it anymore. I noticed that my brother was running across the circle. And when you got to the circle, you had to zen, which meant that you stopped, you looked forward, you went at the same pace, you didn't look right, you didn't look left, because the traffic was insane and still is to this day. But if you did that, you didn't die when you got across. So you would do that. You would zen across, then you'd run to the bus. So I blackmailed him. I told him that whatever he was doing, I needed to be part of, because I couldn't stand to watch The World of Susie Wong one more time. I told my younger brother and sister that I would sell them if they came out beforehand, which they totally believed. I was a horrible sister. And I found out that my brother was, basically clearing out the PX, Postal Exchange, before we got on the military transport to go downtown. And so we decided that our product would be baby powder and Hershey bars. He would leave me there with my mat, my crate, and I would sell baby powder and Hershey bars for 2 years, and I made a lot of money.
Weren't you afraid being out in the market over there? How was that experience, just being in a market in a foreign country? I assume that you've learned some of the language. How was that whole experience of selling stuff at a market in Vietnam?
Well, I never could get or master Vietnamese. It's a tonal language. So it's like our word, oh. It means very different things. So So I basically learned French, which everybody knew because they had been dominated by the French. In fact, the reason we had come into that country was because of the Indochina Wars and Vietnam. The French were given Vietnam back after World War II, and they continued to fight they had before World War II, which was they didn't want any foreign rule. But still, the populace was fluent in French, and that's what I used. I found no problem. I found that what in those early days, kids weren't bothered. It's kind of like an unwritten rule that the children were not to be bothered. However, you could get in a taxi and they'd take you right to your home. So in Saigon, everything was known. They knew who you were. They knew where you lived. They didn't bother you. If anything, they were helpful to you. But I also had this strange man that would come and just kind of stand in between the stalls. And I couldn't decide whether he was there to protect me or whether he was there to spy on me, because the regime was set up with a ton of spies. They were all kept separate, but they all reported to New, which was President Diem's brother. So I didn't know whether he was a spy or whether he was there to protect me. He came every time and he left, and he never said a word to me. The stall owners were great. They would, I would trade or leave my candy bars with them, and they would kind of keep my crate so that I'd be back there next week. So I definitely found the people to be incredibly wonderful.
I can't imagine being in a, that young and in a foreign country, happening in somebody else's, in a cabin and just going somewhere. It's parents right now probably can't even imagine that. Although we got all the technology right now to track, and kids have cell phones and everyone is in constant contact. But still, during a war in a foreign country, that must have been a really interesting experience that shaped you. You also talk about Vietnamese history and how different the culture is. A lot of people, when they think of Vietnam and they think of the war with Vietnam, they have this maybe curated view that's kind of shaped how things were. You being there, how did your experience differ from what we were getting delivered over here as, like, hey, this is what's going on in Vietnam?
I was very lucky. We had a servant who had a daughter who was a college student, and I think she took me on as her mission to try to help me understand her Vietnam. But if you really go back and look at the history, it's been a country that's been fighting for its independence forever. As the Chinese, there's a wonderful quote from 18th century emperor who said, or Chinese emperor said, the problem with Vietnam is you can invade and you can dominate, but they eventually throw you out. And so no matter what, we were going to get thrown out. I mean, it was just the mission. But I think the Vietnamese in the beginning, they really thought that Americans were going to be helping them to create an independent country that would not be under colonial rule. They saw it as similar to our struggle with the British, that we no longer wanted to be under foreign rule. They fought with us, the Americans, against the Japanese in World War II. That was Ho Chi Minh with his Viet Minh. What happened in World War II was when it was over and the French, the Allies were asked, what do you want back as far as countries? And the French said, we want Algeria and Vietnam. So they went back in, and the war that had been going on before continued. They ended up losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and then calling the Allies again. That would have been 1954. And the Allies came in and said, okay, we'll divide the country at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh, you take the north. Emperor Baudouin can take the south, but he wanted to be a playboy in France, so he refused it. But they brought in Diem, and he was living in Paris. He basically was not one of the people. He had three very poor brothers in South Vietnam. One was a Catholic bishop, and the other two were New and Khan. They convinced him to come, and they convinced all of the different factions. There were so many religious factions and military factions. Everybody wanted a peace, but they decided that they would back Diem, even though he only had like 2 blocks of support in the whole city. But New was quite devious, as was his wife, Madame New. And they eventually eliminated all of the competition, all of the people that were fighting against them, and they took control. But they were not of the people. Madame New actually didn't speak Vietnamese. She spoke French. She came from, the courts, the royal courts. And the people felt she was absolutely two-faced. And what happened with them, which was unfortunate, is he brought in all of his cohorts that were completely corrupt. And the poor people that were out in the villages were getting their rice taken. They were starving. They ended up having to come into the cities to starve further. And so even though we were there supposedly to help with the democracy, it really wasn't a democracy. And Jim actually thought he could have the Americans out in 2 years. So history continues today. But what happened was this document that my father gave me was the result of his counterpart, wife. Her name was Nye. She saw Madame New up in Balat, and she saw her going into General Dawn's boudoir. And Madame New saw her, and Madame New didn't like anybody knowing anything about what she was doing. And so she packed up her children, Mrs. Sam, and she went home and to her husband, who was my father's counterpart, Colonel Lee Van Sam. And he wrote up this expose revealing every single member of the GM regime, how they were not pro-American, and basically the intent of the news to get the Americans out. So we came in with a program, but we came in with such ignorance about what the reality was in that country. We supported a corrupt regime. I think our attitude was, we just, helped to win World War II, and this is just the peasant country. They're just rice growers, and they have water buffalo, and this is a piece of cake. And they had no understanding of history, because anyone who knew any history had been eliminated from Washington during the McCarthy era. If you knew anything about Asia, you were obviously a communist. One of the things that, I keep pushing is try to understand history, because if you don't understand history and country before you go in, you're destined to failure.
One of the things that when I was reading parts of your book, the approach that Vietnamese that you describe, how they have, how they view death, and that was very interesting. Totally different way of thinking about it than Western world. What are your thoughts on that? How when you heard about that first time, that's a different approach to considering death, and tell me a little bit more about that.
I thought it was a beautiful religion, because the 80% of the country was Buddhist. So their view of the world was more or less based on the will of heaven, and that is whatever happens, it's not you and it's not me. It's the result of the will of heaven. It really affected how they also approached this conflict. We had this thing where, later on in the conflict, in the war, it was a body count. But see, as far as they were concerned, their life continued, because if the father died, he was cremated, he was put into the rice fields, which sustained his family for years to come. The celebration of Tet was about coming home. And not only was it those who were alive coming home, but it was also their ancestors, their dead ancestors, to come home. Our whole idea of how we were going to maintain, that we're winning, was based on something that had no place in their culture. They would have fought till every single one of them had died, because in their mind, they continued on. It didn't end with death, and you were honored and welcomed by your family long after you passed. I tell people to go back to Vietnam, especially veterans, because what they'd find is they'd be embraced, they would be welcomed, because they would look at you as though it wasn't you, it was the will of heaven, and it wasn't them. And also Ho Chi Minh said, don't be angry at the American people. It's the government. And so they have a very interesting attitude towards us returning.
Have you been to Vietnam since?
I was supposed to go this last November, but because I was going down for a habitat build south of Saigon, but that was when the book was actually coming out and I couldn't go, but I'm going to try to go this year.
And what are your plans when you get there? What do you like? Are you going to revisit the places that you were as a child, or? Well,
it's interesting. The street that I lived on called I lived on Don Thi Diem to begin with, which was near the ambassador's house, and that street has, I think, retained its name. The second location we were in, because the Chinese owner of the first villa started to not want to be associated with Americans, so he had to move. We ended up in a street called Fontainebleau. And Fontainebleau was an amazing character. He was part of the Nguyen court, and he had been tasked with trying to identify whether the French were aggressive. This was in the 1800s, whether the French were aggressive or not, and would they be taking over. And he created an embassy in Paris, and he basically said, no, the French have no intentions of dominating Vietnam, which was not true, and therefore he really died of shame. He committed suicide. But there was a street named Fontainebleau in Saigon. When Saigon fell, there was a statue of him there, and they leveled it, and they renamed the street Dien Bien Phu after the battle the French lost. So it was very symbolic, and a lot of what they do is very symbolic. Their holiday of Tet, whenever there was a major offensive during those early 60s, it was around Tet, and that was the celebration of coming home. So you kind of never lost the significance. When they did something, it was very symbolic.
So other than visiting places where you were as a child over there, what else are you gonna do? Do you still have any contacts over there, or anybody who you keep in touch, or?
Well, yeah, I'm developing new contacts. I'm through Facebook. I've made a lot of Vietnamese friends. We're also a group. There's not that many of us that grew up in Saigon as kids in the early years. And so we have a group called Saigon Kids, and we're starting to connect and identify, and so many of them have gone back. One girl had gone to her former residence, and she was kind of standing there crying, and an old lady came and put her arm around her and said, no, not you, not me. It's okay. But I want to go north. I want to go to Hanoi. I'd like to go down through the whole country. And I'd like to go to some of the places that I definitely know. There's also another person who's an architect who's been identifying all of the French buildings that used to be there. And so I've been in touch with him, and I'm sending some of my dad's photos, and we're kind of showing then and now, like how it looked at that point and what it looks like now. So I'm working on this year to get much stronger contacts.
Any plans for publishing your book in Vietnamese?
That would be wonderful. I would like it in all languages. I just have to find somebody who would be interested in doing that. And that's part of why I'm trying to build these contacts.
Right. I mean, it would have been interesting to actually even see, Vietnamese feedback or perspective on your book, and like how, what you described in the book and their take on it. How was your publishing? Because this is your first book, right? How was your experience publishing a book?
Well, I feel like I'm trusting in the will of heaven too, because I had no idea exactly what I was doing, and I joined a group that was kind of helpful in that. And they had a publishing coach, and I called her when I'd finally written the book, and she said, "Oh, I'm consulting with a new publishing house. Let me see if I can pitch it to them." I mean, it went so smooth that I just assume I'm meant to do this, because they said, okay. And so I was off and running. In fact, some of the problem was they wanted to speed it through. So instead of taking 2 years, which is the normal book, they wanted it in 1 year. And then the other thing they did, they're experimenting with a different kind of contract. So instead of being out of the loop in terms of your book, they give you a 50% contract, so you have 50% say in it, and royalties when they come after all the expenses have been deducted. So I found that interesting, because I had control in the design for the book cover. I ended up painting it and designing it, because I didn't feel that the designs I were getting really conveyed what the story was about. So my experience has been very good. But it also lends itself to you have 50% of the responsibility to market too. And that seems to take more time than writing a book.
So I'm super glad that you had a positive experience, or such a streamlined experience publishing. As I'm sort of developing this podcast and networking with interesting people, I try to search and look for people all over the place, and we'll have people from South Africa and Syria, and just different perspectives is what I'm looking for. And I asked them, like, how was your experience, publishing your book? And a lot of them are published or self-published books. They go straight to like Amazon, and this platform right now just opens up all the possibilities of like self-publishing your book, and where you get like no help at all. And it's people just try to network and talk about it. And I think it's the interesting topic that's going to carry how popular the book is going to be as well. Although there's just so much content out there right now that it's, all of it is just competing for people's, eyes and ears. And
definitely, it's good if you can work out a marketing strategy beforehand, and that in fact, that's what they asked me for, was a plan. Because even if you go with a straight publisher now, they're not going to do the work for you. You're going to have to do it. So be prepared, write the book, but make sure you've really gotten yourself trained on what you should be doing, and use the resources that you find online a lot of the time. That will help you become a better, the author, a better book sale. I know I'm passionate about my message, so I'm going to keep plugging. I'm working on a screenplay right now of it, because I figure that could help at least spread the word, and we'll see how that goes. I've never written a screenplay either, so it should be fun.
Any plans for book tour?
Yeah. I think this year I'll be starting to put that together, and I enjoy it. I've done a lot of talks. I'm a painter also, so I've painted a lot of paintings based on my father's images as an amateur photographer of that time. And so a lot of times I'll do an art show and a talk and book signing, and it's been fun. It's a different venue. I've done historic society talks, library talks, school talks, art, gallery talks. So I keep trying to put in as many different venues in which I can present this story, and it seems to work. I've one little story that is kind of fun. When Kennedy was president, Johnson came to Vietnam, he and Lady Bird. And we were told we were to get dressed and dress up. We didn't know where we were going. But my father said, okay, and you're in your best behavior, so, shape up. So we get to behind the stables of the palace. There's been a platform that has been built. Now, one thing that we kids knew was that used to have a manure pile there. So the Vietnamese had built a platform in which the American vice president could give his talk to the Americans that were posted there. That was kind of interesting, and that, led to some comments later. But the kids knew, the adults didn't. And then later, and this is part of what some of the documents that are being released by the Library of Congress, and I encourage people to look, because there's just recent releases about the CIA being in Vietnam in the 1950s, their involvement with the French, the things that they did. But two of the documents that came out were, three. One was that the Bay of Tonkin didn't happen, which is what we were told is the reason we were getting into it, similar to weapons of mass destruction. But the other one was that Kennedy in 1963 had written a national security memo number 263. And it indicated that he was going to start to pull Americans out, because he had finally, Jim had been assassinated, but Vietnam was going into chaos, and every military faction was trying to get control and get the support of the United States. And he brought in a historian about the country, and he kind of learned a little bit. And he realized, as he was hearing from the advisors, one of them, my father, the military advisors in the early 60s were saying it's a civil war. We shouldn't be here, and do not escalate. However, they were considering it. So when he finally got a grasp of what was really going on there, he wrote this memo saying we'll start to take the first 1,000 out. 2 weeks later, he was assassinated. One day after his funeral, Johnson said, he wrote National Security 273, which negated Kennedy's memo, and said, we're going to escalate this thing. It's critical to really pay attention to history. I think if anything else, that's my message, because we constantly repeat these things. And especially with this country, I think its history lends so much to understanding what we're currently involved in.
Yeah, it's certainly true. Someone said that history doesn't necessarily like repeat itself verbatim, but you can see the echoes of the past in the present, and there's certainly a lot of parallels that you can draw in modern history and as getting into different countries, and maybe we haven't learned our lesson yet.
No, we don't. And also, you asked about the culture. Theirs was not so much a democracy. It was kind of a mix. Ho Chi Minh had traveled around the world. He even lived in the United States, and he was studying different cultures to try to see what would work and, how he could help to form his country into something that worked for their culture, which had a socialist bent to it. Son worked for father worked for his father. It wasn't, and as a Buddhist, primarily Buddhist country, it didn't have the same issues that Christian countries have, and it didn't look at things the same way. And wherever we go, we really need to understand their religion, their history, how their culture is, what they believe in, because democracy is one thing for us, but it might mean something else and be interpreted differently in another country.
You mentioned something that at the beginning of our podcast over here, something that kind of stuck in my mind. You mentioned how kids live in presence, and I feel there's sort of a renaissance maybe in kind of approaching how we live our lives. There's a very popular book by Eckhart Tolle called The Power of Now, and he's talking about like how when you live that life, when you are in present moment, you almost like you absorb more of it. You don't have as many concerns or fears as when you project into the future and you think about like, well, what's going to happen next. And I was wondering like how when you were there, like how that mentality, or maybe even like maybe that's a Buddhist I guess approach as well, because it's all that there is now, and so when they live in a moment, they kind of absorb all of it and focus on it versus just like focusing like what is next and kind of playing into the future as much. What are your thoughts on that? Like, have you taken anything back from the culture, from the Buddhist culture, from the Buddhist I don't know if you can even call it a religion, but from that culture that you were there, what did you bring back that you still see like affecting you?
Well, I think that it's Buddhism, but it's also I think as a child, especially a military child we're moved every 2 years. We aren't really told when we're moving. All of a sudden we're moving. When we meet people, in fact, the way you tell a brat, a military kid, is just ask them where they're from, and they will pause. You have to figure out like what answer do you want to give, or how do you want to start this conversation with this person, because if you have to go through the whole litany of where you've been, they just look at you like you're something strange, a bug out of somewhere. You're adaptive, and you have to be adaptive because you're moved without notice. You're told you can take one thing, like that you had. What did you take last time? Do you want to take that, or do you want to take something new? And we're all the same, these kids. And so when we meet each other, we're in the moment because we don't know if they're moving tomorrow. We don't know if we're moving tomorrow. So we don't ever evaluate somebody in terms of what we don't like. It's like, what do we like about this person that in the moment I can have a relationship with? And we form friendships and bonds immediately. And we also assume we will never, ever in our lifetime see that person again. I think I met one person one time. So I think that upbringing creates that kind of continuous present, because it's the life of that culture, military culture.
Well, that's something I can totally relate to in terms of the question of like, where are you from? Like, what influenced you? And I typically answer like, well, pick a decade, because when I was a kid, I grew up in Poland, and then I grew up in New York. I grew up in Brooklyn, Manhattan, New Jersey, Maryland. Now I'm in Utah. It's like, well, pick a decade. That's like people want to put you in a certain box, right? They were like, well, oh, you're from here. Oh, there, I'm going to put you in this box. My idea of like what it means to be from a certain place, but when you moved all your life and you were influenced from all these by all these different cultures and people, it is kind of difficult to like kind of put yourself in that tiny little box and here it is. This is Sandy, right? This is Adrian.
Yeah.
So I totally understand. But it's a different perspective of forming and building relationships when, as you said, that you don't expect to see that, your friend again, because who knows where they're going to be.
It creates a problem for later in life, because you can kind of go away for 10 years, and I assume I will pick up right where I left off. A lot of times they're mad because you went away for 10 years.
Right.
But where I had problems with civilians, when my father retired, they were going to send him back to Vietnam in '64, and the family wouldn't have gone with him at that point. And he and his counterparts and other military that were there, they weren't in agreement with the fact that it had become a political football. When it was under military control, the decisions that were being made sense. But once it became political, which it did, he just didn't feel he could support it at all. So we became civilians. And that, I'll tell you, that was scarier than living in Vietnam.
How so?
I didn't understand them, and they didn't understand me. And I came back, I'm still wearing Vietnamese tailored clothing. I still have my hair kind of cut off because I wanted to look more boy-like, because if you were female, officers, anybody there who was missing their family, they'd come and hug you and pick you up. My sister she and I'd put our back to each other and kick, just to keep people, and also the blonde hair was unusual. And so you would get petted a lot by the Vietnamese. They just wanted to see if you were different from them. But in civilian life, it was more like that just because you were different. I spoke French. I was in advanced classes. I had just come from a country they had no idea about, because it was really still not known. And there were cliques. I never had experienced cliques, kind of mean girls, mean boys. It was all confusing and very, I couldn't wait to get out of high school.
I was going to ask you about, like, what were some of the, surprising good or surprising bad things that you experienced over there. But I think one of them was surprising interesting, maybe, was like, someone touching your head and your hair, like, hey, are you real? Like, is this real? Like, you're blonde, and like, we haven't seen
Oh, yeah. Well, that's why I did so well with baby powder. I would put it on and just let them feel my skin with the baby powder, and I could sell. And then I kind of put it in my hair, and they'd feel my hair, and they thought that was good. So those were my sales techniques for the baby powder. And of course, the Hershey bars sold no problem.
Yeah. So, and you were doing some marketing work, right? Later on in your life. So
I ended up being going into marketing, and I would say that my experience in Vietnam trained me for product sale.
So let's talk about when you got back from there. How was it to transition? What lessons have you learned, I guess, from bringing some of the experiences from Vietnam? And did you apply any of that in back home? Or how was the transition for you in general? And where did you ended up
well,
being in?
I think I was very aware of children, not having had, in a sense, a childhood. And also, I got very curious about child development, and also how you know what you know, the biology of cognition. So my interests moved into that realm, in which I began to study Piaget's child's conception of physical causality and child's conception of the world, and found that it really helped me to understand myself and the stages of my development, but it also helped me to understand children. And so I felt like I had to take that and do something with it. So I built adventure playgrounds for HUD. I had a children's museum, which was all experiential. And then I got recruited by the Children's Television Workshop, who are Sesame Street, when they decided to design and build a theme park called Sesame Place. And so worked on the design, concept design, and then later stayed doing educational programs for them. And so I was able to take this kind of feeling like I hadn't had a childhood, and then be able to create these experiences of what it would be like as a kid, like, sliding into 100,000 plastic balls on a waterbed, climbing up, 3 stories high on a cargo net. What were all the things I would have loved to be doing? And so I put that into the designs and the concepts. And so I, in a sense, having to grow up too fast, I could go back in time later and create these great experiences and live vicariously through other children.
So that is very interesting, and I wanted to talk to you about that. The experiences with child development related topics. Building and how was your experience at Sesame Street? And give me. I'd love to hear some interesting stories.
It was wonderful. Best job I ever had. We pretty much, there was a designer concept coordinator, Marilyn Rothenberg, who had come up with the physical child, the social child, the emotional child, and the cognitive child. So those were the 4 principles of the design. And what we had to come up with was activities in which children of different ages would get different experiences from it, or have a different. But what happens with a kid who's, let's say 4 or 5 compared to one that's 8, it's not that you can change the way they look at the world. You just provide them with more experience so that when they move into the next stage of development, for example, an example would be, what you did as a child. You ran along and you looked at the moon and you told the kid running with you, you said, "It follows me." And the kid next to you says, "No, it follows me." And you're both going, watch, it's following me. Now, you can't make him believe that kid is following him, because you're pretty sure it's following you. And you won't change that, but you can give a lot of range of experiment within that, so that the questioning is more sophisticated when they change. And that's a biological change. You can take a kid into a room and say all the doors and windows are shut, and put your hands together like that, and they get a breeze. Now, the child that's about 5, 6, if you say, "Is there any, what is that?" They'll say wind. And you say, "What is wind?" And they'll say air. And you say, "Is there air in this room?" And they'll say no. And you say, "I'm confused because you just told me that was wind and wind was air." And they look at you like you're the most stupid person on the planet, and they go, "It's inside you, silly." Now you take the next kid who's older, and that child will say, "It's inside you, it's inside the room, it's outside." What we were tasked with was take an activity that maybe a 5 and 6-year-old would find some interest in and get to experiment, but the other kid would get a different experience. And so if you could find and create learning environments like that and meet at least 3 of those 4 design principles, then you had a winner. So it was great fun. And it was great fun to work with the people, because it was like everyone getting to be a kid again. And also with Sesame involved, with the characters, the whole intention of Sesame Street, which was really, Joan Gance Cooney started it because she saw that kids retained what they watched when they saw 3-minute commercials. So she structured that show around a 3-minute program. Everything was 3 minutes, not more than 3 minutes. So she took her advertising background and utilized it to create experiences for children.
Being a father of a 4.5-year-old and watching her grow so fast, and I get those glimpses of how she perceives things, and I sometimes catch myself in noticing, like, wow, how that mind is open to everything, and how as an adult we lose some of that, right? We fall into these. Mm-hmm. These patterns or these paths that we establish in our lives, and being able to kind of step back and step out of it and try to see different things from different perspectives is becoming fairly more and more difficult. You have to kind of train yourself. You have to remind yourself, like, all right, let me just not fall into this trap again. So it's a learning experience.
It's about staying in the present.
Yeah, and that's another big change in my life. Noticing that, not being focused on too much on projecting into the future, and then trying not to carry your past. And it seems like kids, that's what they have, right? They have that present moment, and that's, I'm just here now and I'm playing and everything is awesome, right? And you just watch them, and you can't be unhappy watching a kid that's happy. You're like, wow, like it's unbelievable.
Mhm.
With all the experience that you have with the child development in that domain, what were some of the surprising things to you when you were doing work for Sesame Street? I'm super curious. It's been, that program has been built out many decades ago, and now some people go back and kind of try to analyze it and kind of take it apart. But it was a revolutionary kids programming, right? I mean, a lot of people grew up on that, and so a lot of things that they had to figure out, like you mentioned, some of that built around like a 3-minute block of time. What were some of the other things that when you joined that program and you were working there and helping out, that you were like, wow, that's just surprising?
Well, one of the things people don't realize is that the characters really represent different ages. For example, Big Bird's 3. Oscar's just Oscar because we all are grouchy at some point in our life and time. But it's okay. Even with your grouchy, you're going to be loved still. They're not going to reject you. Cookie is 2, loves to eat cookies and has an obsession for cookies. Grover is 4. He's Super Grover. And he definitely feels that he is invincible and nothing will hurt him ever. Bert and Ernie are 5 and 6. So when you really look, you'll see the children gravitating to different characters as they become older. There's certain ones they just feel mirror them. Now, we had a problem when we ended up doing the park because originally we didn't have costume characters because their voices are the voices of, for example, Carol Spinney, who unfortunately passed recently. He was Big Bird and he was Oscar, but you couldn't have that voice. The technology wasn't there at that time. And so we created a character called Honker because he could honk his nose and respond to you. So a kid could come up and do that. But it took time, and we finally were able to get the voices recorded and we could do a live show. But we had to be really careful about putting the character out. The other thing is, for a child, that character is about 2 inches tall on their TV. So now they come to a park and you've got an 8-foot Big Bird. So the parent sees the Big Bird from way far away. The kid is all excited. The kid has been nothing but excited and bothering them about going and seeing Big Bird. They're going to see Big Bird. But as they get closer and closer, for this child, that character becomes a monster because he's 6 foot tall. He's not 2 inches. And even for the older kids, when we would walk some of these characters through, like Bert and Ernie, they'd go, Bert, don't you know me? Bert, why aren't you talking to me? Why are these people next to you taking you away? Are you okay, Bert? So there was such trauma around the characters in the park. So we had to kind of really come up with a way to do this in which we didn't traumatize children. And we also, the adults sometimes would be just out of control. They'd want to throw that kid into Big Bird's little wings. And, despite, it's like, I brought you here, you've been wanting to see him and not understanding the child's reality, which is, he should know their name and he is only 2 inches tall. So, as adults, we have to really pay attention to these things. Even like a little kid going to see Santa now, you've got to take into account that this is a very big character compared to maybe how they've been seeing them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I can see my daughter when she is sometimes vacillating between that, like, oh my gosh, I love Santa, and then they see like one of those inflatable Santas, and she's like, what is this? And just see how they
it's like, what happened to Santa?
I'm trying to reconcile the two and not sure how that, so it is fun to watch that. I take everything as a lesson from her, because it really is an interesting world that they live in. So
also there's another side to it too, and that is the adult always feels that they need to be in control. So when we designed the park initially, it's changed quite a bit now. We made it so there was a Big Bird walkway with a moving slat bridge that went to the end where there were these tubes that slid down into this 100,000 balls on a waterbed experience. You could walk down, but that's generally where the kid would go. Adults go to the right. They don't know why they go to the right. They go to the right. You could put an interesting water ride to the left. They won't go there. They go right. They stand in lines, and they don't even know why the line is there, but they'll stand there. So what would happen is the family would come in and veer to the right, but the kid would see the big bird walkway, head up the walkway, get on this moving slat bridge. The parent would be fearful that they were going to lose the child and would follow after them. And the best comment I ever got was a man who came to the guest relations window, and he said, I have to tell you about my day. My son got on that walkway, and he's moving, he's going. I don't know where he's going, and I'm afraid of heights, and I freeze. But my son turns around and says, come on, Dad, I know you can do it. And that changed the relationship of their experience in the park that day, because now the adult wasn't controlling. He was being allowed to be part of that child's world. And, we'd see that again and again. And that was always our intent, how to kind of, disarm the adult of their, preconceived ways of doing things and let it get into the child's world so that they could really have a different experience.
Maybe we should start designing parks for both kids and adults.
Well, I found that if I
boxes.
The best way to get an adult to play is get him in a swimsuit in a water park. We actually put in water because we were having trouble getting the adults to play. So once we got them, which I couldn't even believe that they would go into a park and disrobe and walk around in a swimsuit all day. But once we did that, that also took down all their defenses and they would play.
That's very interesting.
Adults became, we never had any graffiti or theft or problem with one child. 650,000 people coming in a short period of time. But the adults, we had to design totally different activities in order to get them to play. And that was fascinating because we knew kids, we just didn't know adults.
I feel like there's an inkling of your next book in this topic.
Yeah, probably.
Because that sounds very interesting, because it's not only what you can kind of imagine and build out what you think would be fun for both kids and adults, but also like based on the experiences that you had, right? Like you've noticed like, wow, okay, this has happened, like, and this now can be shaping how you're going to be designing something next. And maybe there's a thread in there that you can pull on and write a book. Because I think it's some people circle back. I certainly, in my 20s, I definitely was that person who wanted to have that control. That's the mode you're in. You want to have control. Then as you grow older and you kind of train yourself a little bit more and maybe get yourself exposed a little bit more to be open to different perspectives, maybe you reclaim some of that. And then ultimately maybe, when you have kids and you learn even more as a parent, because then you've made just almost full circle. Now you watch your kid and watch them grow and how they process things. And you're like, wow, okay, well, that's an interesting thing. I've never really thought about it that way. So it would be interesting to hear more of your experiences and maybe that's the topic of your next book. How to build a.
That could be. You never know. I'm just following my inner child.
That's the best way, I think. That's what I reconnect with. What gives you, what do you follow as a passion and exploratory things that you continue to learn, love to learn, and learn how to learn in your life, and based on that, build some relationships. I think that's kind of like how I'm going about things right now, and it's making me happier, I think. Yes.
Yeah. The key, I think the key to life is not to be afraid to try things. I mean, my path has always been, if somebody asks me if I can do something, I go, yes, because I figure I can figure it out. And if I don't, well, I tried. At least I tried it. So, even being an author now, I mean, I hadn't written a book before, but I had so much fun doing it and taking those memories and then trying to kind of fuse it all together into something that made sense, but also because I'm in some sense an educator at heart, help you to learn something you didn't know before. And so, as I said, just, say yes. People say, can you do this? Say yes, figure it out. You're smart enough and you'll enjoy the ride because it'll definitely be different and you won't find yourself bored and you won't find yourself resentful and you won't find yourself getting to the end of your life and wondering what life did I have? But, that's the sad part.
So what do you say to people that would rather put you in some kind of a box?
I think it'd be hard to box me. I know people try at times. They're like, so are you this? Well, kind of, and no, and I'm happy if I can't be put in a box, because it means that I have so much more to do, which is what my plan is.
So you're also a painter, and actually when I saw the cover of your book, I suspected that you painted that. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit more about the girl. That's you, right?
That's me at 8, and I was a brownie. When I was a brownie, yeah, that was my uniform. And I had seen my father. He'd basically taken the bathroom in the basement. We were in Hinsdale, Illinois at the time, and they were sending him for his master's at University of Chicago before sending him to Vietnam in ordnance. And I think it was probably more kind of organizing principles. It was a school of business he was in. Anyway, he would go down into this bathroom basement, and we weren't allowed in there, and there'd be this red light that came out from under the door. Now, you do that to a kid, they're going to wonder what's in there. Is it a dragon? Is it like what, and why does he stay in there for hours? So one day he I don't know where anybody was, which is hard to believe since there were 6 of us in the family, but nobody was around. So I snuck down the basement, went in, and I flipped on the lights. And luckily, nothing was being there to be exposed, or I probably would not be living today. But turned on the lights, and he had taken a lot of images during World War II. And like I said, he was Patton's guy, and so he was, trading. He was filling up water tanks with French cognac and wine and trading it for tank treads, and he was doing all sorts of things. But he was always out in front of Patton, and he had a BMW convertible he found under a haystack, and he put false requisition orders in it and silk-screened a Red Cross thing on it and drove it through the war. But he would always be out in front of Patton to find campsites, and he came across a concentration camp, and he took photos. Well, in this makeshift dark room were the strips, because he had developed the film, but he had never printed it, so he didn't know what was on any of it. And I pulled up my stool to climb up there and see what it was, and I saw the bodies. I saw, emaciated figures on wired fences. I saw pits with these things in there, and I realized that I didn't know my father. I'm 8. Seemed like a regular guy, and then I see these things, and because I wasn't supposed to be there, I couldn't say anything. I couldn't ask. So then I decided I needed to spy on my father forever. So my mother would find me in this brownie outfit, even on non-brownie days, because I thought it looked pretty official. And she'd go, "Sandy, it's not a brownie day." And I knew it wasn't, but I thought, in this outfit, I could really spy. So it lent kind of a training so that by the time we got to Vietnam, I was a really good spy. I had a Girl Scout outfit at that time, but I didn't feel I needed to put it on. So this painting I did is me as that 8-year-old in that uniform, and that's why I say brat growing up in Vietnam in 1960.
I was going to ask you about that part of the title, a spy, a kid in Vietnam, but also a spy. So now there's a little more context to that. Regarding painting, how did you get into that?
I think I've always painted, but I know when we were in Saigon, my mother hired a Japanese woman who was teaching watercolor painting. And I wasn't very good with that because it was a medium that it dried too fast and I couldn't make changes. So I would sketch, and I loved to sketch. And as I went through school, they'd introduce you to different materials. So by the time I found oil paints and acrylics, and that things could wait a while and you could change them also quickly if you needed to and work with it. So I in high school I was in art class, and in college I did that, and then went to Cal Arts and studied art and design. And I just always painted, and I had let it go for a while I was doing all this work with designing and children's activities and things. And it wasn't until I had finished with that phase of my life, say, or that kind of moment of being with Sesame, I started painting. And I found that it was great. The first show I had, it looked like a group show because I hadn't defined my style. It looked like 12 people were in there. And they probably were. Me. And so I had to kind of develop a technique and a style that I was comfortable with. But I can do realism, I can do abstract, I can do conceptual. But this particular style that I'm using now is I'm doing series based on my dad's images of Vietnam. And I feel like, I look at this as art as storytelling. This art is also the same story I'm telling in the book, whether it's words or images. And I try really hard in the book to make it visual, and so that you feel like you're seeing things, you're smelling things, you're there. Because I think that kind of experience will make you bond more with the story and be part of it. And the same with a painting. Like, how do I draw you in so you feel like you have a story that you recognize?
I find painting very therapeutic. I think it's not only just try to replicate something that you want to paint or capture something. I think it's also the process is a great teacher, where you're learning how to let go, because you're learning how to let go, because especially if you're like a perfectionist and you want to, like, oh, this has to be perfect because someone's going to see this, right? And so I'm doing this not for myself but to show others that I am a talented person. But I think the real lesson is to really let go and try to explore different things, which is super difficult, especially for adults, with we're like, oh, it has to be good or it's trash. And so when I started painting, or was taught a little bit how to paint, it was the process of letting go. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to mess up nose, or I'm going to mess up the eyes, and it was like, no, let's just try to explore these things. You can always put another layer and cover things up and try again, right? And I think it's in that sense, when you get to that sense of a flow where things are just kind of going through, and you're like not clinging to, oh, this has to be perfect, and you realize that what you've produced doesn't have to be a carbon copy of whatever you're trying to paint. It's the capture of it's the captured process of you going and getting there, right? And I think that's what's very therapeutic. I love it. I wish I had more time to do more of it, and so
you'll get to it. You'll get to it. It comes later too. I was very surprised that I moved on back into that, but I'm enjoying it.
So what's next for you?
Well, I'm going to work on the screenplay, and I feel that seems it's a medium that people are adapting to quite rapidly, as far as where people aren't reading as much, which is also why I have an audio book, and I also have the ebook, so it can actually travel with you. But I still love paperback books. I love, printed books, because that's where I can lose myself, and I have to be careful not to start reading something because I won't put it down. But I think the screenplay is something that gives a lot more access, and it might develop the curiosity enough to read the book, which I hope can be the case. But the quandary is, does one do it as a movie, or does one do it as a series? And that's what I'm struggling with right now. But I hope to do that. That'll be this year. Well,
I hope to see you hopefully here in Utah if you're going to be on a book tour. Would love to have you in the studio and dig a little bit deeper in some other things. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your thoughts and your life in this book. And I wish you the best. I hope that you get to get it translated into different languages and kind of give everybody else that kind of glimpse of the reality that you lived over there, and hopefully reshape someone's perspective on things.
Well, I hope so. And I encourage people, you can go to my website at www.sandyhanna.net. And I'll give a lot of background. There's some of the paintings are there, and some of the interviews. Yours will be up as well. And I just, I tell people, in fact, people have told me they can't put the book down. They don't go to work. They don't go to yoga. They start reading and they think they're going to read a chapter or two, but then they just keep on going. So, warning, be careful. Make sure you don't start until you have some time. But thank you for the opportunity to talk with you as well.
And thank you for helping me over here as well, learning from you. That's how I take this podcast, a podcast with interesting people. It's about talking to interesting people, gaining different perspectives, learning from experiences of others in the world, and hopefully bettering oneself. And so I thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope to see you in person at some point, hopefully over here in our studio, and having another awesome podcast and chatting about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks for listening to a podcast with interesting people. Please subscribe and leave a review or comment.
And support us by sharing our episodes on social media. We really appreciate it. And for more information, visit us at apodcast.com. Thanks.